Welcome back to Maximum Production, a Holstein Friesian New Zealand podcast about everything to do with cows. I'm Amelia, and today I'm talking about something a lot of New Zealand dairy farmers have been waiting for, and that is the NZAEL base cow update, which is coming this month. So joining me today is Dr. Melissa Stephen, a senior quantitative geneticist with NZAEL, or Animal Evaluation. So thank you for joining me, Melissa.
Thanks, Amelia. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
So Melissa is an expert in everything regarding what goes into the BW system and how it is calculated. And Melissa actually joined me on a webinar last year talking about the fertility BV update with one of our members, Hayden Lawrence, which is available on our YouTube channel if you do want to check that out. But today we're talking about the base cow. So to get started with, as always, Melissa, would you like to tell us a little bit about your background and how you got to where you are today?
Sure. I started with a commerce degree at Lincoln University. It's a little bit left field for what I've ended up doing as my career, but I just have always been interested in farm business type things. And my first job out of that degree was with CRV Ambreed. I worked with them initially in their herd recording team and then later as a sire analyst. And that got me really interested in thinking about the power of genetics and breeding on farm. From there, I joined NZAEL as a developer. So that's a role where you sort of really focused on farmer communication, helping farmers understand how to use breeding worth and the underlying breeding values. And as time went on, that sort of sparked a deeper interest for me in the science of genetic evaluation. So I went back to study and I got my master's and then PhD. And since finishing my PhD, I've been working for Dairy NZ as a geneticist, helping improve the accuracy of national evaluations. And that includes this base cow update that we're talking about today.
Oh, so lots of experience working around that genetic base. And I think it's good that you've kind of come from an outside point of view into what you're doing, because a lot of people kind of think, oh, this is what I want to do, including me. Changed my degree a year and a half in, wouldn't recommend it. But you kind of go in thinking that this is your area, this is going to be your niche. And then when you actually get out into the real world, you realize, well, actually, this is quite cool. And I want to try something different. And I think this might be more likely my niche, which is awesome.
Yeah.
You should be really proud of where you've ended up. And I think what NZAEL has been doing and what you're doing with NZAEL is a strong representation of what you are and what you have been able to achieve so far.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah. It's interesting. I was drawn to business and sort of commerce studies because of my interest in rural banking and numbers and how they make things tick, and ended up being also drawn to the animal side of farming. And I feel like genetics and genetic evaluation is a way of joining those two things together, because although I get to work with animals and a lot of the data I'm working with obviously comes from animals, I'm also looking at numbers most of the day and data files and whatnot. So it's a really good way of getting the best of both worlds for me.
Were you a farm kid growing up or a city kid?
No, city kid. Yeah, I was raised in Whangarei City and then, went down to Lincoln for my degree. And that's sort of when I got introduced to the farm rural world.
We won't hold it against you that you were a city kid. So do you want to just give us a bit of a background on what NZAEL's role is in the NZ dairy industry?
Yeah, sure. NZAEL has a role in the industry of holding or being the custodians of the national database. So we call that DIGAD, the Dairy Industry Good Animal Database. And we receive data from the two herd recording providers in New Zealand, CRV and LIC, and we hold that data for the purpose of animal evaluation and improving genetic evaluations for dairy cattle. We also have a really important and cool role around extension, and so that's around teaching farmers how they're best to use evaluations and how those evaluations can improve their profitability on their farm over time.
Cool. So, as you said, it's a part of Dairy NZ. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah, we're a wholly owned subsidiary of Dairy NZ.
Yeah. So, in general, your role is to kind of oversee the data and make sure that it's correct in the way that the farmers can see it and the way that the animals are represented.
Yep, that's right. We're looking to see that the data that we're getting in is of high enough quality to use for animal evaluation. So we have data quality checks and balances in place that either lets data into animal evaluation or doesn't. And then we feed that information back to the herd recording providers as well. And then, yeah, as I was saying with extension, as well as teaching farmers how to use the evaluations we produce, it's also talking about how they can record data better on farm to improve the output of evaluations, which will make them more useful to them as well.
Which is really important. Herd recording is something that's extremely important on farm, and yeah, I would love it if farmers did a more accurate job at it, but I know they're busy, so.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, a lot of farmers do a really good job of herd recording, and we have very high rates of herd testing in New Zealand, I think, compared to most countries around the world. But there are some realities of our farm system that make it quite difficult to record things accurately. For example, all of our calves being born in such a short window makes it sometimes quite difficult to make sure that they're being recorded to the right dam, the calves are being recorded to the right cow. So there's things like that that can really, if the attention to detail is dropped, then it can really upset the integrity of the evaluations. And so, yeah, there's always going to be a need for improved data quality in our data.
And I think that's the thing, like, we're not perfect, and I don't think we're ever going to be 100% perfect, but I think it's just important that farmers do continue to work on it and see how they can make things better on farm, and how they can make sure that they do record things or do have processes in place that they can make sure that their records are as accurate as they can be for them, whether it's introducing genomic testing or making sure that you're doing regular night checks so that you can, more likely catch cows calving throughout the evening if that's something that you would prefer to do. Personally, no. This is not foal watch on a horse stud. Personally, I think I'd go with the genomic testing option. But, that is a really expensive thing for a lot of farmers. So I can understand that. Not every option suits every farm. And so people just need to look into what works for them and make sure that whatever process they put into place is going to give them the best results they can, to ensure that that data going through to you guys and that you're able to filter out is as accurate as possible.
That's right. Yeah, as you say, no one's perfect, and we're not going to get perfect records, and we're not asking anybody to sort of compromise their own health to get these records in there. But there are some things that people can do, I'm sure, to build things into their routine that would help the accuracy of data, like parent verification through genomic testing, or, different things around procedures around how they record cows and calves, that sort of thing. There probably is room for improvement in some areas.
Yeah, but as you said, we're always working on it. So as you guys are always looking at new data and new ways to improve data, farmers are always looking at ways that they can improve their systems on farms. So I think we're all doing a great job on where we're at, and that everyone just continues to move forward. I think that's a great way to go.
That's right.
If we get to the reason why we're here then and start talking about the base cow update. First off, what is the base cow?
Yeah, right. So the base cow is a group of well-recorded cows from a specific age group. And so at the moment, we're using a base cow that is from 2005, and we will be updating the base to a 2015 born base. And so the criteria for a cow to become a base cow is that they are well recorded, and so there's a series of things they have to have, like a certain number of herd tests and things like weights and TOP inspections and things like that. And we need to choose a age group which is well past the point of getting new phenotypes, because the group that we designate to be the base cow needs to be very stable, because we can't have the base evaluations moving from one run to the next, because that would have everyone's evaluations being unstable. So we go for a cohort of animals which is reasonably older. So we're updating to 2015 now, and that will make them, now that we're in 2025, it'll make them 10 years old. And it's been a decade since we've updated it last, and the last update was 2005 born base.
So I guess, as you said, there's been quite a bit of a gap since the previous update and where we are now. What was the reasoning behind such a big gap? Is that normal, or is it normally on a more regular basis?
Yeah, we would usually update the base every 5 years. So that update was due in 2020, but we had various other priorities going on in 2020 and decided that we didn't have the resource available to do it justice. From a technical perspective, the base cow update isn't a big job. It's really more of a communication job because it's quite disruptive. All of the BWs and breeding days of the animals will all drop, and so that's quite disruptive to farmers, and we need to make sure that we're able to support it with enough communication. So back then we decided there wasn't enough resource around for us to do it justice, but now we're in a good position to make sure we communicate it properly and well.
And let's be honest, 2020 was a write-off for everything, so maybe it was a
Yeah.
good idea that we skipped 2020.
That's right, yeah.
So, as you said, there's a big drop and it comes down to BW. So, what exactly goes into the calculation of that base cow?
Yeah, so the drop in the base cow essentially represents the BW of the new base compared to the old base. So we were using a 2005 born base, and those animals, which are our new base cows, would previously have had a BW of 185 on average.
Cool.
So now we're rebasing to them. So we zero out their evaluations, so they become zero, and everything else has to have 185 on average removed from it to make them relative to that new base.
So that drops them down to about 56 or something, doesn't it?
Yeah, the new average is somewhere around there, around 50, 55. Yeah.
Yeah. So compared to what's happened in previous years, is this a normal amount or is this higher than what you would normally see in a base cow update?
Yeah, if you think about the base cow as reflecting a genetic trend, and for the genetic trend, we sort of speak of it being between in the past $10 a year, and it's been up to sort of 15 and beyond that. And because we're speaking in dollars when we say that, then you have to think about inflation when you think about it, because it's not the underlying breeding values, it's the value of the change in those traits. And so that's a dollar value, and inflation has obviously affected everybody. So that genetic trend going from what we used to talk about $10, now more like 15 and maybe 18, not necessarily saying that the genetic trend is so much better than it was when we were talking about it previously, but it's the value of those changes in traits have gone up. So to get back to your question, if you think about, is this a normal amount of change or not? So yes, it's a normal amount of change at a breeding value level, but the dollar value seems high because inflation has come into BW like it has everything else. Yeah.
So it's not unexpected. And this also, from a farmer's point of view, and they're going to see on their records, what is it, the 20th of June, this is meant to be happening. And they're going to see these animals drop. That doesn't mean that their genetic value has decreased, does it? It just means that the BW has dropped due to your changes.
That's right. So every animal has dropped by the same amount, well, roughly the same amount. And so
What is it, like, give or take about 5 points?
that's right, yeah, 4 or 5. And so if you had a cow who was your best cow before, based on its BW, it is still your best cow. And if you used a bull who was the best bull, he is still the best bull. It's just that everything has been rebased down by 185. And really the point of genetic evaluation is to rank animals, not necessarily to provide an absolute number that values that individual in isolation. It's about how does that animal rank compared to the other animals you have the ability to choose from. And so that ranking system is completely unchanged, but the actual absolute numbers have decreased by 185, give or take 5.
Cool. So we talked a little bit about BW, and I didn't send Melissa this question, but I know that she can answer it. So do you just want to go into what's actually in the BW? Just give it a bit of a breakdown for us so that people, especially if there's new farmers out there, first season or anything like that, just to give them a better understanding of what it all entails.
Yeah, sure. So BW is made up of 10 different traits. They are milk fat, milk protein, milk volume, live weight, gestation length, fertility, somatic cell, functional survival, body condition score, and udder overall. And so there's kind of a rough, I don't know, like 60-40 split between what we would call production efficiency. So it's production relative to the live weight and kind of milk volume, and robustness, or like health of the animal, where in that category you would incorporate sort of fertility, condition score, udder overall, survival, those things. So yeah, we value those traits according to their economic value on farm to a farmer, and weight them accordingly. So that weighting ends up in that sort of 60-40 split. And as economics around the farm change, then those weightings will also change to reflect that. So a good example is the relative value of milk fat and milk protein. So that's something that has been pretty volatile in the past, in terms of fat has at times been nearly worthless and also the only thing that's been valuable in milk, in history. So we include those changes in the calculation to make sure that what we're breeding for in our index is reflective of how farmers are being paid.
And so I guess that's constantly changing, isn't it? Like season upon season, depending on the production of that animal and whether or not it gets in calf, and the rate in which it gets in calves is what's going to ultimately come into play on how that BW changes over time.
Yeah, so there's probably two pieces to that. The first is that the BW calculation, like sort of in the background, changes one season to another, where those values, like the value of milk fat to protein, will change. But then also there's the information we're receiving on individual animals, either the cow herself or a bull's daughters, for all of the different traits. So you might have a bull coming through that doesn't have any daughters at all, and so his proof will be based on either his parents or our genomic information, and that will give him a certain number for all of those different traits, which we'll then apply our economic values to and say, this bull is worth whatever to a farmer. And then he'll go through the period of his daughters going through their first lactation, and he'll get a whole lot of herd test data in. And that will give us some real information on the genes that he's passing on to his progeny, and we'll accordingly update all of his breeding values to reflect that new information. And so that will change his ranking. So he might actually be much better than we thought once he gets his daughters of his own, or he might be much worse, or he might be the same. And we make those changes and adjustments. Well, they get made as part of our calculations, I should say, depending on how the data sort of plays out.
And the same with the female, it starts originally 50-50 dam and sire, and then changes once they start getting their own progeny on the ground, or once they start lactating.
Yep, that's right.
And getting herd tests.
Yeah, same for a bull, and that a cow can also have a genomic test as well. And so depending on who your recording provider is, you may have that information flowing into the breeding values and BW that you see. But really, once she starts getting her own herd tests, that's when we'll see that real data flowing into her indices, and she'll start moving around a little bit to reflect that. Less so than a bull, because a cow can only provide you with one example of her genetics, essentially, and potentially some daughters as well, but less examples. Whereas a bull can, have 100 coming through at one time as part of SPS or whatever program they're involved with.
Yeah. Right. We talked about the drop, and you talked about there being a bit of a difference. Why is it that there is a difference? Is this due to new traits being brought in through the BW over time, or is it some cows might have shifted due to other things? I don't know. Can you tell me why there is a variation of 1 to 5 BW points?
Yeah, sure. So usually in every base update previously, the change has been pretty well exactly the same for every animal. There might have been some like really small rounding errors, but it was pretty much the same. Since our last base change, we've introduced udder overall as a trait in breeding worth. And udder overall has a nonlinear economic value. So that means that an animal that has a very poor udder is penalized more than an animal who has a very good udder is rewarded. So it's a really useful tool to use in the index, because it means that we can sort of introduce that really severe penalty on a cow with a really poor udder without having it skyrocket off the other end, where a cow with a really good udder is just, getting us enormous BW, which probably isn't warranted. And so it was deemed at the time, and has been discussed many times since, that it's quite an important feature of udder overall in the BW, that it's non-linear like that. And so, but that means that when it comes to a base cow change, it's not quite as straightforward, because if you imagine that you've got a bell curve of all of the animals' breeding values, and you've got some that are average and some that are very good and some that are very poor, you're sort of lining that up with a non-linear economic value, where the number that you apply to the breeding value, which usually in a linear case would be the same no matter what the breeding value is, you'd be applying the same value to it. In the case of udder overall, you apply a different value depending on the genetic merit of the animal. Essentially, you're valuing each step up of the udder overall breeding value is being valued differently. So, sort of a long story short, but you're trying to line those two things up together to say, how do you place the economic value over the breeding value? So we've done that, and then when it comes to a base cow change, you're just going to shift all of the breeding values down in line with the base cow change, and so you also need to make that shift for the economic values, and you won't get that exactly lined up as you did before. You just can't. So that means that there'll be some bigger than rounding errors, but still pretty minor differences between cows, just caused as an anomaly of a nonlinear economic value.
Lots of technical terms.
Yeah.
So, correct me if I'm wrong, but if an animal has got a better udder, then she is likely to have a slightly different change than a cow with a poorer udder. I'm not saying it's a bad udder, guys, just a poorer udder. So it's going to mean that she's maybe not going to drop all the way to 56. She's going to drop to 57 or 58 versus a cow with a poorer udder, which is going to drop down to 56.
That's right. Yeah. There'll be slightly different
Cool.
changes depending on what their breeding value is for udder. Yeah.
But that change is not extreme. Like, I don't know. To me, I'd say 4 points is not a huge difference.
No.
But I guess that plays into when you were introducing udder overall, which I can't imagine was an easy trait to kind of fit into how everything else is calculated. And it did take you guys a lot to be able to get it in there.
Yeah.
So it's just trying to make sure that it lines up and still makes sense, but not affect that BW. I do agree with you. You don't want to see this cow that, I'd look at her and be like, oh, she's got a great udder. But that's only quite a small aspect as to how well she produces.
Mm-hmm.
And it could potentially create longevity for her, but then you're calculating longevity already. So it's kind of something that's a minor detail, but is important for cows long term.
That's right. And where we came to with that udder trait is that it is very damaging for a cow to have a very poor udder. So, something that's less than a 5.
So that 5 is on a TOP scale of 1 to 9?
Yep. And so, a cow if you imagine a cow with an udder less than 5, that's going to be quite damaging to her in general for lots of different reasons. And the difference between a 5 and a 7 is quite substantial when it comes to her value to the herd. But the difference between a 7 and a 9, maybe not so much when it comes to her ability to make profit in the herd. So that's kind of what we're reflecting.
From a TOP inspector's point of view, there's a huge difference between a 7 and a 9.
Absolutely.
But from your point of view, not really.
Yeah, that's right.
Completely understand where you're coming from there.
Yeah, like physically, absolutely, the difference is the same. If you're looking at the cow, difference from a 5 to a 7 and a 7 to a 9 should be the same. It's a scale. But in terms of their economic contribution to the farm, not the same.
I think the other way to look at it is like the TOP data that you're kind of looking at, the udder overall data is coming from 2-year-old animals, correct?
That's right.
Yeah. So as a TOP inspector, when I go out there, the amount of 9 udder overalls that you see in 2-year-old animals is quite minuscule.
Mm-hmm.
And so a 7 to us is great. A 7 on a 2-year-old. If I go out and do a sire proving herd and I see a 2-year-old that's got a 7 udder, I'm like, that's a good udder. I'd buy that cow
Sure.
because I know that it's going to last. Whereas if I see a 5 udder on a 2-year-old, I'm thinking I give her 2 seasons.
Sure.
And so I look at it that way. And the reason why I look at it that way, and everyone looks at it differently, but I think a 5, that ligament strength is potentially just not there. So she's more likely to give out, and you're going to cull her as a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old because her udder is given out. So that longevity's gone. Whereas a 7 udder, and I'm not saying at a 6-year-old she doesn't give out, but I'm saying that she's more likely to last, which is going to increase the longevity in that way. And I think that's how you kind of look at it, that between a 7 and a 9, there's not much difference than there is between a 5 and a 7.
That's right. Yeah, agree.
Yeah. So I think this is where it also comes down to, are we going to be losing data here with the sire proving schemes kind of cutting back, that we might not get as much TOP data coming through in our 2-year-olds?
Yeah, that's something that we within NZAEL think about quite a bit in terms of data quality and gaps in the data. So we've got quite good coverage, not excellent, but quite good coverage of the population at the moment with SPS and progeny testing schemes, and then the Breed Society scoring that happens as well. But if either of those two things were to cut back, then I think we would start to see some gaps in the data. And going forward, it's going to be a question of how do we fill those gaps and whose responsibility is it to fund that, essentially.
I think from just like a listener's point of view, at this stage, we score between like Holstein Friesian New Zealand and Jersey New Zealand and Ayrshire New Zealand. I think we score somewhere around about 30 to 40,000 2-year-olds a year. That's covering the sire proving, the progeny test teams, and then the pedigree 2-year-olds as well. So that is a lot of data.
It is.
That's currently going in. So I wouldn't say the pedigree side of it's necessarily going to drop. Look, if you're out there and you want us to do a TOP, give us a yell because we're here. And I think as much as it's important data for Melissa and her team, it's also really important data for farmers just to see kind of where their cows are sitting. But yeah, if we are seeing a reduction in the amount of herds that LIC and CRV who do those sire proving and progeny test schemes taking on. I know that LIC's done a huge reduction because they no longer have proven bull teams. So the whole point of the SPS program was to prove those bulls. So if they're not having proven bull teams, do they need to be doing a sire proving scheme? And I guess this kind of comes into a little bit about if we look at this not just on a New Zealand scale, but on a world scale. So taking that forward, is the base cow something that only happens in New Zealand, or is this something that's happening throughout countries all over the world?
Yeah, a base cow update is common around the world. I would say most countries running, formal evaluations are doing it on a regular basis. It's a really useful and important way of keeping your evaluations at reasonable numbers. If we never did a base change, we would end up with, enormous numbers for our indices, and there's really no benefit to that other than making it harder to interpret. So by doing a base cow change, we bring everything back to a number that's easier to read, easier to interpret, more relevant to the current situation.
Yeah, I don't know. Do we not want a 2000 BW cow?
I mean, yeah, you could, but then if you imagine, you've got a cow who is $2,000 BW and another one that is 2010, that's just a little bit harder to interpret than if you've got one that is 50 versus 60.
Yeah.
And there's really no real good reason to let them get big like that. The other reason why we do a base cow change is to keep the reference point relevant or relatable, I should say. So if you imagine at the moment we're comparing to a 2005 born cow, there aren't any of them alive still. and they've not been alive for quite a long time. And so it might be quite hard for a farmer to picture what did a 2005 born cow look like, produce, and what does it mean when you say my cow is $100 better than a 2005 born cow. And if you imagine if our base was then a 1940s cow, then that's really difficult to reference, because we might be saying, okay, well, your cow is $2,000 better than a 1940s cow. And that's a really hard number to interpret.
80 years is a lot of breeding difference.
Yeah, that's right.
I can tell you right now that a 1940s cow does not look like what our cows and our herds look like now.
That's right. Yeah. And so, yeah, moving the base as we do, it just keeps that reference point relevant. And we say, okay, well, if we move it to 2015 born, there's probably most farmers out there can picture 2015 born cow or thereabouts. And that's kind of what we're referencing to. So it makes a lot of sense to do that.
So then continuing on like the international view of it, they don't do a lot of sire proving schemes overseas anymore because a lot of it is genomic based. Their bull turnovers are extremely high. So is it that they're using more genomic data to calculate their base and I guess their comparison to their base, or is it just taking it mainly from taking any physical traits out of it and just focusing on your economic values?
Yeah, so when you're running a genomic evaluation system, you still need phenotypes, absolutely. So whether you get those from a formal sire proving scheme progeny test type system, or whether you get them from a sort of structured reference population that's structured in a different way. So that might be that you've gone out to a bunch of herds where they're farmers who are committed to data quality, and you say, I want to genotype all of your cows, and we're going to measure all of these phenotypes on them. And so it's not run in the same way as SPS, because you're not saying to them, we want you to use these young sires and then have their first daughters. You want them to use like a breadth and width of sires, but there's a little bit more scope for choice, I would imagine.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you absolutely still need a very solid core of phenotype data coming in every year. And yes, you need to be updating it every year. So in terms of a base cow, in a genomic context, you would still have age groups of animals with very detailed and very stable evaluations, because they would be the cows that you've measured all of these phenotypes on as part of your genomic reference population.
And I guess overseas, especially in like some of the European countries and things like that, breed societies are a lot bigger over there and they're doing hundreds of thousands of 2-year-olds just within that pedigree scene. So I guess there's a lot of data actually coming in from that. I guess it depends on where their data goes and whether or not it's going into that program straight away or whether they have to get it through some other way. But I guess that's another way for them to ensure that there is still lots of data coming in.
Yeah, that's right. And, in New Zealand, back to our situation, even with potentially reducing sire proving and progeny testing system or process, we will need to replace that process with another phenotyping initiative, which will be about collecting phenotypes on genotyped cows or the progeny of genotyped bulls. And so the work that I was sort of talking about before with NZAEL looking for gaps in our data, that becomes quite important going forward, especially if these very structured programs of sire proving are no longer as strong as they were. We need to be, keeping a really close and careful eye on any gaps and holes that are appearing in our data sets.
So I guess if anyone out there has been part of a progeny test or sire proving scheme in the past and they want to keep doing it, just get the data. Please reach out to your breed society and we'll come out and inspect your animals, and that way then NZAEL can continue to receive that data. Unfortunately, though, it's on your cost instead of your AV companies, but it's all good data. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right, and essential to the ongoing success of our evaluations. And so, the question around who pays for that data is something that will need to be discussed. There will be a lot of companies, farmers at the end of the day will benefit from that data because they'll have bulls that are going to improve their herd and for those traits. But where the responsibility for collecting the data sits will be a question going forward.
We've talked a lot about kind of what the changes are and what the base cow itself is. But how can farmers actually use this base cow information to help themselves make better decisions on farm, better breeding decisions on farm?
The base cow change itself doesn't really, directly alter anything in terms of breeding decisions, because the cows you would have chosen yesterday will still be the same cows you'd choose today. Where it should help is it'll make all the numbers a little bit easier to interpret, it'll make differences easier to see, but it won't change your decisions, the decisions that you would have made.
Yep. Now that the base cow change is kind of in the process, are there any other updates that farmers can expect over the next 12 months or in the near future out of NZAEL? Like, where is your next vision taking us?
Yeah, the big project that we're working on at the moment in collaboration with CRV and LIC in particular is the 1BAW project. So that's looking at combining genomic breeding values from CRV, LIC, and NZAEL, and potentially other third parties as well, so that then farmers can make use of that genomic data to select animals across company. So at the moment, if farmers are using genomic indices, then they have to sort of use them within a company because there is no number that is comparable across. Whereas the objective of this program or project is to bring the information from the two companies and potentially third parties and combine it in a way that can then put it all on the same scale. Our team is really excited about that. That's something that NZAEL has been working towards for a long time. Yeah, and it's just going to be really great to work with the two companies on that.
And so that's bringing together the NZMI from CRV and BW from LIC. And then I guess over time, you'll start including how it's calculated in other companies like Salmon, because Salmon's now got their own way of calculating it. So eventually, the idea is to include all of those ones as well and make sure that it's the same across the box. Is that right?
Yeah, it's at the breeding value level. So in terms of NZMI or other indices, it's sort of agnostic to indice in lots of ways. So it's at the breeding value level, combining genomic predictions for, say, protein together to make one comparable number. So that if you compare a protein breeding value for LIC bull versus a CRV bull versus hopefully, Salmon and other companies' bulls, you'll be looking at something on the same scale. In terms of indices, our hope would be that we could get some coordination around that as well, but that can be separate to the breeding value side of things. In terms of other companies that we can work with, so yeah, we absolutely hope to bring in these other companies other than LIC into the arrangement, but there is a question around, fair commercial terms. So how does that look around the investment that both CRV and LIC have made into genomic technologies and their own evaluations, and how do we sort of allow companies to protect their current investment and ongoing investment, but also support new entrants into the system. So those are all details that need to be worked through in the fullness of time.
But for now, if people are trying to compare LIC to CRV to Salmon or CMEX, I always use the NZAEL bull search. That's possibly your best way to look at it at the moment to make sure that you can kind of compare what your values are, especially with those overseas ones when I don't know if you've looked at one of those bull proofs recently, but they can sometimes look very different and can be quite confusing compared to an LIC one or a CRV one if that's what you're used to. So would you say that for now it's not going to be completely accurate, but that is a good way for you to kind of compare?
Yeah, if you're needing to compare across company, then certainly NZAEL's evaluations are the ones to use. But bearing in mind that NZAEL evaluations don't have genomic information informing them. And so if you're looking at a bull on NZAEL system and it's much better or worse on CRV or LIC's evaluations, or an international one as well, probably, you should take that into account to say, actually, if we had genomic information on this young bull, it probably would be a lot better or a lot worse, because I can see that reflected in its CRV or LIC evaluation. So yeah, it's sort of, it is tricky at the moment. You've got to do a little bit of mental arithmetic around the whole thing to try and work out where you sit. And that's why, at NZAEL, we're very excited about the prospect of 1BW to get them all on the same scale.
Oh, it would be so much easier for farmers out there if they knew that there was just one thing that you could look at and be like, yeah, these are all the same,
Yeah.
knowing where that difference is. And I understand that it's hard. I kind of, because people ask me all the time, oh, what do you think about these bulls? And if it's very much like an overseas or a North American bull and you're trying to compare it to like even something from CRV, they look completely different. And I know that going into NZAEL, it is no genomic data, but at least they're on that level playing field that there is no genomic data.
Mm-hmm.
It's just kind of how it's been put in, rather than when you look at it on its CMEX proof and then you're looking at this different bull that's on a CRV proof and you're like, okay, well, this number's way higher than this number. Does that mean that this one's bad, or is it just that's the way because that's how it's been calculated, or it's calculated in pounds instead of kilos, and everything like that can make it really confusing to look at as well.
Yeah.
Even if it's not the best level playing field, at least it can give you a better idea of what you're looking at to then be able to convert it into what you actually want on farm.
That's right. If you think about, an evaluation being useful as a way to rank animals and not necessarily absolute values, that makes it very difficult to compare across different systems, because the absolute value is really not relevant. It's the rankings within animals that is relevant, and those rankings are not the same across two different systems. So that's particularly true of, an international evaluation versus a New Zealand evaluation, but it's still true across company as well.
So is there anything else that NZAEL is working on at the moment that farmers might be a bit interested in?
We do have a sort of phase 2 of our puberty work. So it might have been something that I mentioned in the podcast last year when we were talking.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that a lot of the listeners would have heard us talking about it before, but the puberty scale-up study in Holstein Friesians, where we measured the age at puberty in 5,000 Holstein Friesian cows across 50 or so herds. And in that research, we found that it was moderately heritable, which is quite exciting for a fertility trait, which usually are very lowly heritable. And also it was correlated moderately with fertility later in life. So it's potential that puberty trait could be used to predict a cow's fertility down the track and give us earlier proofs for a bull's fertility. And so the problem with that, or the limitation, I should say, with that study was that it was done in Holstein Friesians and a few crossbreds, whereas our national population is hugely admixed between Holstein Friesians and Jerseys. So now the phase 2 of that research is to repeat it in Jerseys, and that cohort of Jersey cows have just finished their first lactation. So we've got all of that data coming in hot off the press, and I'll be looking at that over the next 3 or 4 months, and we'll be hopefully coming out with some information around what that looks like in the Jersey breed. And the goal for us going forward with that would be that it does look good in Jerseys, hopefully, and then we would look to work it into the national evaluation for fertility as a predictor trait going forward.
So what was the kind of idea, just so those that might not know about, what was the purpose behind this puberty study in the first place? Was it trying to get a better idea on when animals reach puberty, or like going forward, their growth?
Yeah, it was specifically looking for traits that could give us an earlier indication of an animal's genetic merit for fertility. If we go back even a step further, we had a study where we had a herd of 400 cows, which were very divergent for fertility. So half of them were very high fertility and half of them were very low. There was a 10% difference in their fertility breeding value. And then we measured a lot of traits in them to see.
A lot. I was involved in that
lot.
trial when I worked at Dairy NZ. I think we collected like 30,000 blood samples.
Mm-hmm.
There was a lot of traits.
Yeah, it was a big job. And so, yeah, of those traits, there were quite a few that were of interest, but one of them that really stuck out was puberty. So the animals that were in the high fertility group reached puberty on average a lot earlier than the animals that were in the low fertility group. And so that finding led to a scale up, if you like, into the Holstein Friesian cohort of 5,000 cows. because although we were seeing that in a small group of animals, you have to sort of corroborate it with a bigger data set, and that's what we did. And then phase 2 of that is, now do we see it in jerseys? And once we do, we'll be pretty confident that we can move forward with it. I guess the next question will be around cost, because puberty is quite an expensive trait to measure. At the moment, in these cows, we've been measuring it using blood tests. So that involves, a qualified person taking bloods, and then those bloods being sent to a lab to be processed. And also, it's serial blood tests over time, because you need to try and pick up the time when the cow actually becomes pubertal. So, half the herd won't be when you first turn up and do one blood test. But so that's quite an expensive way of measuring puberty, and maybe not scalable across enough animals to become a useful predictor trait. But there are other ways of measuring puberty, like activity monitors, which, once we've established that the trait puberty is of high value, then we can start looking at different ways of measuring puberty that might become more useful in the future. And I think that activity monitors are pretty safe bet that they're going to become quite widely used in the future. So it may be that it's a case of almost waiting for them to become widely used enough that the trait can be brought in. But at least with this research, we will know that that's on the roadmap. It's going to be an important move for us to make.
If it was to come in as something, would it be included in the kind of recalculation of the current fertility trait, or would it be a separate trait on its own that's calculated, separate fertility trait?
It would probably be included within the fertility trait as a predictor. So although we would still only publish the fertility breeding value as you see it, it would be in the background informed by this puberty trait that's also measured.
Yeah. So you're not going to see it as like an outside person looking at it, but it's just going to be part of the calculation to make it more accurate. Again, more data, better accuracy.
That's right. Yeah. The really exciting thing about puberty is that it's so early. So we would actually get, like, fertility's got a few limitations at the moment. The main one being that the trait is really difficult to measure and got a low heritability. But the second one is that the fertility traits tend to come after the animal already has a lot of production traits recorded. So selection can happen because you've got the production traits. You know that the bull's going to be amazing for production, but you don't quite have the depth of knowledge around its fertility. So you can end up with bulls that actually might not have that good fertility being used too soon. Whereas if we have this early indication of fertility happening well in advance of any production traits, then it might sort of save some of those poorer fertility bulls getting out there.
I know that a lot of the farmers that I deal with, and it's always a big thing if you go to a sale and you see people sitting there, one of the first traits that they look at if they're buying stock is fertility. And when they're looking at picking bulls, then you ask them to put a list together of what their kind of selection basis is. Fertility's high up there on, I won't select anything that's a negative fertility.
Mm-hmm.
There's still a lot of bulls coming through that are negative fertility, and it does make it really hard for farmers to try and make accurate decisions on what they're doing. So more information to make that trait better, I think, is not a negative thing for farmers.
That's right. Yeah, fertility is a really important trait from lots of different perspectives. The ability for a cow to live a long time in the herd is really important. And so anything we can do to get better data and more accurate breeding values is going to be a good thing.
But everything takes time.
It does. Yeah, research takes time.
Sadly, not everything happens with the flick of a wrist or something like that, and all of a sudden all your data is calculated for you.
Yes.
As you said, like, this is phase 2, and it's taken to get them to the end of their first lactation, that's 3 years minimum, and that doesn't come into the planning that goes prior to that.
Yep.
It's been a long time coming to get to this point.
Yeah.
You guys are doing a great job to get that information out there. Yeah.
It's a process.
Yeah, the sad thing about research is not everything happens overnight. A lot of planning, and then a lot of time goes into it, and a lot of technical time.
Yeah.
It's great that the original research has now extended into bigger trials that you can get better data for you guys and for our farmers to make more informed decisions on farm, because that's what it's all about, is making sure that our farmers out there are more informed so that they can make better decisions and that they can make improvements on their herd without losing any data or losing any genetic gain over time. So thank you for all your hard work, Melissa. Keep at
That's
it.
okay. Yeah. Yeah.
So I think I've taken up enough of Melissa's time. As you said, she's got a lot of work to do to make sure that our listeners out there can do the best as what they can do on farm. So thank you so much, Melissa, giving up your time today to have a chat with me. You're always a wealth of knowledge and it's always a great conversation. So I really appreciate you talking about the base cow, BW, its effects that farmers have and how it affects their herds. So thank you. And if any listeners out there are wanting to get a bit more information about these changes or BW or anything like that, the best place to go is to check out the Dairy NZ website, which we'll link in our show notes down below. So you can click on that and find all the information that you need to be able to get any information that you feel you're lacking to make informed decisions, or if you feel like you don't understand the base change or anything, have a look, read up on it, and yeah, reach out to your local Dairy NZ rep if you even need more information as well. They're another place to kind of hit up. So if you have any questions about today's topic or any other topic you would like us to talk about, you can get in contact with me through our website, Facebook, or Instagram. As always, linked in our show notes. Thank you all for listening. Thank you so much, Melissa. I will be back next month with a new guest and a new topic. Until then, happy farming. Bye.